The big weaknesses, the kind of long-term, the sort of historical, systemic weaknesses are much the same as other bits of the country that over the last 30 years or so, to condense the story a bit, used to have a lot of people making things and now don't have so many people making. So there's a huge number of jobs that used to be there that aren't there anymore. And then it's looking for something to replace those, and that's what you've had for the last 20, 30 years or so. The solution in the 80s and into the 90s was foreign investment. You get people in big boxes doing pretty low paid, and as it turns out, pretty insecure work, not very productive, and not very secure, because as soon as you find somewhere else in the world that can do this work for less money, you close your factory here and you move to Poland or wherever it might happen to be. So that's the kind of the weaknesses, that's a big underlying weakness there. The solutions to this start to look like, well, you have to therefore find different kinds of work that can be sustained over time, that will provide people with decent jobs. Okay, there are two bits to this. The most obvious one is austerity. That whatever the coalition government, the government in Westminster says about the last government spent too much money and it ran up too much debt and all that sort of thing, it just isn't true. Austerity is the direct result of the financial crash and the crisis that erupted in 2007-2008 that led to enormous bailouts for the banks, mostly based in London, of course. When I say enormous, I mean we're talking absolutely, truly incredible sums of money and support. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, thinks that about £1.3 trillion was handed over in direct and indirect support to the banks. So that's 100% of GDP. Everything in the entire country for a whole year handed over to the banks to support them. That's one part of it. Very, very sharp recession, which is what led to the deficit increasing. That's the gap between what government gets in taxes and what it pays out for public services. Very sharp increase in both those. It's a direct result of the crash. The government's response to this, the coalition government's response to this, was austerity. And if you're somewhere like Wales, where because of those historic weaknesses, because you've actually just lost loads and loads of jobs over the last few years, you end up with a real dependency on the public sector for employment and for growth more generally. It has a very, very sharp impact on how the Welsh economy performs. And that's in the context already where Wales is lagging behind the richer bits of London, essentially. I mean, the theory was throughout the 2000s that if you allow the city to expand, it will drag the rest of the economy. That just hasn't really happened. And now we're after the crash, it's getting even worse. Even the small amount that it was able to pull the rest of the economy along behind it, even that's now broken down. So the effects are severe, I think, on Wales. Well, it can do something. There's this sort of long-standing bit of rhetoric, or the way people talk about the problems in Wales, and you go, gosh, if only everybody if only everybody had a degree, or some version of that. If only everybody could just read and write better, then they'd all automatically get jobs. And it's true to a point that if you're better educated, you are more likely to be in employment. That's sort of true. Other things being equal, that's definitely going to be the case. So it's not a bad thing to try and improve people's skills, to give them education, that sort of thing. These are not bad things to be doing. The problem you've got, of course, is that if you're saying, right, we've educated all these people, they have to find jobs. And if the jobs aren't there, and if you look at the situation that lots of parts of Wales where skills and the rest of it are usually held to be the problem, of course the jobs aren't there, then it's no use educating people. They still can't go and do anything. So the real problem to solve here is not so much something government can do relatively easily, something it has direct control of, which is skills and education policy. It can do something with that. It has to do the harder task of trying to find ways to create work. And ideally the kind of secure, decently paid jobs that people actually want, rather than insecure, badly paid work that they've often got at this point in time. Well, this is the interesting point here, that often if people talk about, right, well, let's have an industrial strategy, and what they often mean by that, or what it often turns into, is let's find something big and exciting, like it's really high value added, that's designing computer chips or high-end pharmaceuticals or some big glamorous thing like this, and you go and chase that. And the problem with doing this is that, one, it's difficult to do these things, really difficult. That's why they're kind of high value added, that's why they're quite rare. And the second one is that often these things don't really create very many jobs. If you go and set up biotechnology companies, you employ a few people, but not really that many. So you don't necessarily answer the problems that you're trying to solve. It's hard work, and you don't really create that many jobs out of it. The more interesting prospect is if you look at the stuff that's taking place already. So you look at High Street, there are shops there, there's a certain amount of public services taking place, whether it's GP surgery or a dentist or whatever, all these sort of things. And this is the economy that people relate to on a daily basis. Now there's a potential there, I think. And people like Carol Williams and Kresk of the University of Manchester have made this point before. There's a potential there to look at what you're actually doing, and look at what people, the kind of works people are actually already engaged with, and the kind of production of value that's taking place, and look for ways to expand that. So that might come down to, down to all sorts of things. Food production and food retail and this sort of stuff, different ways of having cooperative ownership of farms, of food production, of retailers, different ways of taking that kind of foundational economy, the one that we're most often engaged with, and doing something interesting with it and using it to create more jobs, because that's the key to this one. Well, exactly. The short version of the Welsh story is that it used to be able and was pretty successful at attracting finance from the rest of the world. In the first instance, the rest of the country, the rest of the UK. In the second instance, through foreign direct investment from the rest of the entire globe. And for all sorts of reasons, those things now look like they're cut off. I mean, investment by businesses in the UK has plummeted since the crash. It was never particularly high anyway. It was never anywhere near as high as somewhere like Germany or France. But it's dropped by about £36 billion since then. So investment from the UK is drying up. And then if you look at foreign direct investment, whatever some wobbling around may be at the moment, over the long term, foreign direct investment isn't going to developed economies like Wales, like the UK. It's going to less developed economies because that's where the opportunities are. So China, India, Brazil. So you can't plug yourself into these ways of mobilising investment and capital. You have to look for something that Wales can do itself, and there are, there's plenty enough savings here. There's plenty enough kind of money tied up in property and the rest of it that you can mobilise and start to invest in creating jobs. That would probably mean doing things like expanding the range of, for instance, banks and financial services that are on offer here. So you'd have local banks and regional banks rather than the big national ones, who, as we all know, are notoriously bad at providing loans and investing in small businesses, largely because they're just ignorant about how these things operate. If you have local banks, you have smaller regional banks, cooperatively owned perhaps, that they'll be much more enthusiastic. You have this in Germany to a very large extent, much more enthusiastic about investing in local businesses, for instance. So if you start to, instead of just having one kind of model for delivering investment funding, financing, instead you start to say, well look, there's lots of different ways you could do this. Maybe big banks are good for certain sets of tasks. They're not really particularly good at anything other than making bankers rich, but leave that to one side. If you look instead at, let's have cooperative banks, let's have stakeholder banks, let's have maybe a public investment bank. Once you do that, you can start to mobilise investment in lots and lots of different ways and start to make a difference on the ground.
And finally, James, your report describes the link between productivity, wages and successful trade. Is there a link between jobs that pay well and a more prosperous Welsh economy?
Yes, I mean, these things all sort of tie in together. The real, if you look at what's happening since the crash across the whole country, but also including Wales as part of that we've hit this very unusual thing where productivity, which is your driver of growth over the long term, if you're in a country like this, developed country, productivity growth, doing more with the same amount of stuff, so being more efficient at how you produce things, that's what drives growth over a long period of time. What's happened since the crash is that productivity has fallen, has dropped quite dramatically. Other countries haven't been so badly affected by this, if they've been affected at all. And what that points to is a real underlying weakness, probably for the whole country, tied into a weakness of investment, a weakness of research and development spending, lots and lots of weakness in infrastructure is a really obvious one, and certainly that's a particular issue for Wales, not having the investment in public transport, in railway lines, the rest of it. Lots and lots of weaknesses there. But if your productivity is falling over time, essentially people are getting less productive over time, which means there's a real pressure that starts to bear down on companies to say they must cut costs. And the easiest cost that they can find to cut under those circumstances is wages. So you're looking to try and reduce wages or reduce hours or chip away at what boils down to people's real standard of living. And that's what's happened for the last few years here. So if you want to get somewhere out of this, productivity matters, and improving productivity matters. And that gets you into a story I think about investment in infrastructure in particular as like a really quick, easy way to start to deliver that. That then can turn into increases in people's real wages, increases in their real standard of living.